You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
On this season of Bad Watchdog, we unpack the Project on Government Oversight's exclusive investigations uncovering the abuse of people in the Department of Homeland Security's immigration detention, and how another threat has infiltrated the agency's own ranks.
It only takes one insider to undermine federal law enforcement attempts to go after crime fighters like these.
Listen and subscribe to Bad Watchdog Season 2 wherever you get your podcasts, starting June 20th.
I'm Howard Dory.
And I'm Jess Dory.
And we host Plotting Through the Presidents. We take deeply researched, deeply irreverent dives into the myths, mysteries, and scandals of the men and women who shaped America.
Join us as we dive deep into topics like
the undeniable riz of Aaron Burr.
The what now?
And the odd feeding habits of everyone's favorite founder,
John Adams?
Subscribe and follow Plotting Through the Presidents now to plot along with us.
Find out more at plodpod.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 201, The Fall of France, last quarter of an hour. This week, a big thank you goes out to Mark, Christopher, Nick, and John for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. They get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes and special member-only episodes, like the upcoming maybe 3-part biography on Philippe Pétain. I'm still writing it, so I don't know if it's 2 or 3. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. The German attack of June 6th and the start of the German offensive, referred to as Case Red, would be the beginning of a very tumultuous week for the French army and for the French government. It would begin along the Somme and the Aisne rivers to the north and east of Paris, and over the course of just 4 days, the situation would deteriorate to the point that the French government would be forced to evacuate Paris. But in the days after the first German attacks along the Somme, there was still some hope that the new German attack could be halted. And in fact, it had been halted in some areas, like at Amiens, like we discussed last episode. On June 9th, General Weygand would send a message to all of the French troops, stating, quote, "Officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers, the salvation of the country demands of you not only your courage, but all the obstinacy, the initiative, and the combative spirit of which you are capable. The enemy will soon be at the end of his effort. We are in the last quarter of an hour. Hold on tight." They certainly needed to hold on, but unfortunately for the French and the British soldiers manning the defensive lines along the front, the enemy was far from the end of his effort, and in fact their attacks were just beginning. On the northern areas along the Somme, the first day of the fighting had not gone well at all for the British and French troops that were involved. Due to a lack of troops, the areas along the Somme north of Abbeville were not provided with enough soldiers, simply, to mount a serious defense against the German aggression. The hope had been that if they were able to pull back to a line along the Brel River, that they could reestablish a defensive line to at least slow the Germans down once again. Unfortunately, this would prove to not be possible due to a complete collapse of the forces around Abbeville after they were attacked by the 15th Motorized Corps commanded by General Hoth. While some French units fought well in this area, the colonial infantry of the 5th Colonial Infantry Division deserved special recognition. However, the general collapse around them would allow the 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions to advance to the southwest without facing any real opposition. Weygand would travel to the headquarters of French General Altmaier, who commanded the 2nd Corps in this area of the front. Altmaier wanted to try and pull his entire army back further, just trying to find a way to keep his army together, even if it meant retreat. Weygand would deny this request, saying that it was essential that his troops hold their ground while the French armies to the south were also fighting. However, it was clear that if Altmaier was going to try and mount a continued defense of the areas where his troops currently were, he was going to have to shift some troops around. Because of the events of the first 2 days of the attack had opened the way for a German attack against Rouen, and so, being such an important area, Rouen needed to be defended. And so the British 1st Armored Division and the French 3rd Light Cavalry Division would be shifted into a blocking position around Rouen. They theoretically benefited from the fact that they could anchor their defensive lines along the Andel River, but There were so many crossing points of this river and so few British and French troops to defend them that each one could only really be covered by a very small force, and there were some that were missed. And also, the Andal itself was only a small stream along many points of its course in the areas around Rouen, which meant that even between the crossing points, there was little that could stop a determined German attack. By the end of June 7th, the panzers of the 7th Panzer Division had reached a position just 35 kilometers northeast of Rouen and had already pushed back some of the French screening forces that were in their way. The battle in the air was going just as poorly for the British and French. Along the lower Somme, the British would be able to claim 4 downed Bf-109s, but this small number cost 11 Hurricanes. With the reluctance of the Royal Air Force and the British government to further reinforce their squadrons in France, the losses on June the 7th and after would leave the British with less than a full squadron of Hurricane fighters actually based in France. The French Air Force did a little better throughout the day, destroying 16 German aircraft, but at the cost of 17 French fighters. The French also lost 11 bombers, mostly trying to launch attacks against the various German motorized columns that had crossed the Somme at various points. None of this prevented a near total domination of the air over the battlefields by the Luftwaffe, though, who were able to bring a far greater number of aircraft to bear against the Allied efforts. This meant that even the successes for the French and British, where they were able to shoot down a few German aircraft here or there, did little to curtail German flight operations across the majority of the front. One item of note here that would occur during this time was the fact that the first bomber over Berlin would sort of happen on the night of June the 7th, with a French Farman NC-223 bomber, which was actually a naval aircraft, being specially prepared for the nighttime flight to Berlin, where it dropped 3 tons of bombs on the city. While the damage to the areas that were bombed were pretty much trivial, the bombing raid required a 3,000-kilometer round trip, which was still pretty impressive, even if the bombs didn't do a whole lot once they got there. Now, being able to drop a few bombs on Berlin did little to solve the growing problems that were being experienced along the lower Somme. On the morning of June 8th, the situation for Altmaier and his units continued to deteriorate. Altmaier would be forced to abandon his headquarters, with the effect of leaving his subordinate units with limited access to his staff until they had relocated, which was of course a constant problem for the French and every other army during the campaign. When a headquarters was forced to move, it took time to re-establish communication links, and that hindered coordination of the subordinate units. On the Andal, the 7th Panzer was able to find and capture an unguarded bridge, which allowed them to quickly start moving tanks and troops across on their way to Rouen. The 5th Panzer would at the same time put more and more pressure on the British and French forces in front of them, and while the Allied units would fight some delaying actions, they were simply delaying. They were not stopping the German advance. Around this time on June 8th, the decision was made to allow Altmaier to retreat all of his units much further back, sort of to prevent large groups of his units from being surrounded due to the advances being made by the panzers around Rouen. But there was just one problem. General Fortune, the commander of the British 51st Highland Division, did not like the path of retreat that was being chosen, which was towards Rouen in the south. Fortune, much like a lot of British commanders, felt that his best course of action was always to stay as close as possible to the North Sea, just in case they needed to get on some boats. When Fortune's request was forwarded to London to retreat along the coast, it was denied, and Fortune was told to conform to the French movements towards Rouen, but unfortunately it was already too late, and the panzer divisions under Hoth were already blocking the 51st path. The reason that Rouen was so critical at this point is that if the Germans were able to capture the city, then they would have a bridgehead over the Seine River, and it's likely that any troops that were stuck north of the Seine, which the 51st was, would be trapped. The only possibility to get those troops across the river would probably be to use boats, and so there were attempts made to get boats together, but that was never an ideal scenario. A bridge was always preferable. Now, the British and French knew how important Rouen was, and they did try to hold on to it. The problem, though, was finding troops to actually do that with. Due to a lack of reserves, the Allied forces in this area, even this important area, were pretty slim, and all that was available to add to that defense to meet the new German attacks were a few poorly trained and equipped infantry battalions. The good news is that the German tanks had once again outrun their infantry, and this allowed a few small units of French soldiers, when they had anti-tank guns, to actually do far more damage than you might expect. For example, one ad hoc battalion, which was formed from new recruits, was put under the command of a regular army officer, Major Alexander Syme, and he would place his troops in a blocking position near the town of Isnaville. After arriving, they were attacked by troops of the 5th Panzer Division, and they would be able to defend against 3 successive German attacks through the use of their anti-tank mines and anti-tank guns. Over the course of the attack, this small unit, again of pretty much raw recruits, would disable 15 German armored vehicles of various types, a solid showing for a unit that did not exist a few days before. But there were limits to what units like this could do, and Syme decided to withdraw his unit before it was totally overrun. This was probably a good move because while some of the small units on the outskirts of Rouen had been kind of successful, it was clear that the German attacks of the next day would push into the city itself, and preparations were underway to meet that effort. In the air on June 8th, the situation was much the same as the day before, with both French and the British able to inflict some losses on the Germans, but at a similar cost in their own aircraft. One notable change is that on the 8th, RAF Fighter Command would agree to send 2 more Hurricane squadrons to France, specifically to help provide some air cover to the British forces in the north. However, these 2 squadrons, while a welcome addition to the skies over France, they loved having them, did not even make up for what the British had lost over the previous few days. While the situation in the north was bad, it was not the only area where the French were having problems, because the situation further to the southeast along the Aisne River was just as worrying by the end of June 8th. The Germans were able to capture the city of Soissons on the Aisne River on that day, which opened up the risk of yet another German area of attack. One of the interesting notes about this attack on Soissons and on sort of that area of the front is that the Germans were able to take advantage of the fact that the new French defensive structure that had been put in place, which had proved itself against the German armored divisions around places like Amiens, was quite weak to more traditional infantry attacks. This turned what seemed like a weakness of the German troops along the Aisne River, a lack of armored support, a lack of armored divisions, especially in the front line, would actually end up being a strength, and they would be able to overrun the French defenses far easier than the armored units were on other areas of the front. While the capture of Soissons was certainly a problem for the French, there were other problems that were about to happen, because on the 9th of June, the next day, the troops under General von Rundstedt would also launch their own attacks across the Aisne, and they were aiming for the city of Rheims. Today's podcast is proudly sponsored by Fold3, the web's premier collection of military records that helps bring the events of World War II history to life. Immerse yourself in over 670 million records as you explore photographs, individual service records, formerly classified military documents, and more. Learn how the greatest generation's triumphs and sacrifices impacted history as you take a front row seat to epic tales of courage, sacrifice, resilience, and valor. Have a veteran in your family? On Fold3, you can combine records found on the site with what you have in your own albums and shoeboxes and attics to create an online memorial for someone who served. Discover your military ancestors today at fold3.com.
What if I told you the federal agency created to stop another deadly attack like 9/11 has been so focused on detaining and deporting immigrants that the most dangerous threat has been allowed to fester within our borders? On this season of Bad Watchdog, we unpack the Project on Government Oversight's exclusive investigations uncovering the abuse of people in the Department of Homeland Security's immigration detention.
I didn't understand how much immigration policy has affected my life until I actually was at the detention center.
And how another threat has infiltrated the agency's own ranks.
It only takes one insider who has an association with an extremist group like the Oath Keepers to undermine federal law enforcement attempts to go after crimes by groups like these.
Listen and subscribe to Bad Watchdog Season 2 wherever you get your podcasts, starting June 20th.
The 9th of June would be a real disastrous day for the French and British troops. So we're going to start back in the north and we're going to kind of work our way south all the way to that attack by General von Rundstedt towards Rheims. Because back in Rouen, the defense of the city fell to General Gaston Dufour, who'd been called out of retirement at the start of the war and was put in charge of the military region around the city. I'm sure this was mostly considered an administrative post at the start of the war. It was hundreds of kilometers from the fighting, but on June 9th, it was the front lines. To defend the city, Dufour had a random mix of troops with some infantry regiments, some engineer units, a few anti-aircraft units, some artillery, all of them at various points of training, most of them on the lower side of training, and also at some level of disorganization. Other units would arrive at various times in the city, and he would try and put them into good places to defend the city, but there wasn't a lot of organization. There was no planning here, really. It was just throwing units at various areas around the city of Rouen. The one bright spot was the presence of 4 new motorized cavalry groups, which were kind of a new concept for the French. These groups were made up of only around 200 troops, which does not seem like a lot, but they were more powerful than their numbers would perhaps make it seem. The groups, abbreviated to GFCs, were entirely volunteer units made up of enlisted soldiers, which meant that by and large they were better trained and motivated than other available French units. They were also sort of built into true combined armed teams, with each group possessing tanks, armored cars, motorcycle teams, mortars, heavy machine guns, and motorized anti-tank guns. On a man-for-man basis, these were probably some of the most effective units that the French army had at this point in the war, and Dufour would be given 4 of them to bolster the defenses of Rouen. He would spread them out and assign each one to defend some of the bridges along the Seine. The bridges over the river were critical and would be the focal point of the fighting over the following days. For example, early on June 9th, troops of the 7th Panzer under the command of Rommel would attempt to capture some bridges at Elbeuf, to the south of Rouen, only for them to be destroyed by French engineers right before they were captured. Then, when they approached some other bridges, they would run into one of the GFCs, the one commanded by General Huet, who had positioned his 2 25mm anti-tank guns in the village of Agoville. The French unit would also be supported by a company of the British King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. When the Germans approached the village, they would quickly be fired on by the anti-tank guns, and some vehicles would be destroyed. The fighting would continue for about half an hour before both the French and British would begin to pull back to the bridges that they were there to defend, with these bridges then being destroyed by French engineers after the troops were across. Similar scenarios would occur on other areas of the Seine around Rouen, with French engineers waiting as long as possible before destroying bridges before they could fall into German hands. While destroying some bridges was of course a fantastic idea, and while small units around Rouen were doing their best to prevent the Germans from making an easy crossing, there were limits to what could be done against the German forces that were descending on the city itself. The 5th Panzer Division would launch its attacks early in the morning of June 9th, easily pushing back some of the weak screening forces that had been placed on the outskirts of the city. They then ran into another of those GFCs, this one under the command of Captain Ricard. The 200 men of the 5th GFC, which is the one that was ran into here, would delay the German attack for 4 hours, even though they were heavily outnumbered, and they would lose half of their unit in the effort. They were eventually forced to retreat when the German units were able to bypass them by using other routes through the city. These routes were defended by weak units of reservists with nothing but a few old FT-17 tanks. Those were World War I designs, trying to stop these new German panzer divisions. By 11 a.m., most of the French units had been forced to cross south of the Seine, and the bridges throughout the city were destroyed, which helped keep the Germans north of the river. But that also meant that any of the Allied troops still north of the Seine, especially those that were closer to the coast, were now completely trapped. Hoth was able to recognize the tricky situation that the British and French closer to the coast were in, and he immediately redirected some of his mobile forces to move west after Rouen was captured, to fully trap any forces that remained north of the Seine. Rommel and his 7th Panzer Division were called upon to make this quick advance, and they would make about 70 kilometers in a single night, arriving on the coast on the morning of June 10th. This was a disaster for the British troops in particular, and Fortune had decisions to make, and he had to make them fast. Regardless of what his orders were, he wanted to get his men out, and so he began to look for a place to try and evacuate as much of the 51st Highland Division as he possibly could. The problem was that, with the Germans already having moved to the coast, his options were pretty limited, and so the best option would be for the Royal Navy to bring his men off the beaches at Sainte-Valery-en-Caux. When I say that it was the best option, that still meant that it was an option that was pretty bad, and the small beach that was present at this location would make for a poor conduit for troops onto ships, but that was all they had. So once again, the Royal Navy was called in to execute an evacuation mission, with this one being given the codename Operation Cycle. Unfortunately for all the British elements involved in the operation, the Germans arrived first, and would be in position to begin shelling the British ships with artillery even before the 51st arrived on the coast, which caused the Royal Navy destroyers, which had arrived, to very quickly evacuate themselves. Even when the 51st arrived on the morning of June 11th, they would be unable to do the one thing that had made the evacuation at Dunkirk possible: keep the Germans away from the beaches, with traffic jams and communication mistakes greatly hindering the efforts of the British troops to establish and expand a perimeter. Of course, it did not help that the Germans were doing everything that they could to prevent the evacuation, and by the 11th, parts of 3 different German divisions were either on their way to St. Valery or were already in contact with the 51st, including Rommel's troops, which had been able to fight their way into a position where they could fire directly onto the evacuation beaches, making, honestly, the entire operation impossible. Given the situation and the dwindling ammunition that they had, both the French and British troops that were trapped around St. Valery would surrender on the morning of June 12th. In total, about 3,300 Allied troops, about 2/3 of them being British, would be evacuated from the area before the surrender, with all of them being brought aboard ships from a small coastal town about 6 kilometers up the coast from St. Valery. Another part of Operation Cycle would see about 11,000 British troops evacuated from Le Havre on June 13th, with those troops being lucky enough to get out before the Germans were able to take control of the area. Now, the areas around Rouen and then on the lower Seine were not the only areas where the French were having serious problems on June 9th, because 160 kilometers to the east, the Germans had been able to cross the river at Soissons. The primary German formation in this area was the 9th Army, under the command of General Strauss. In terms of the overall course of the fighting, the most important difference between the fighting in this region and the fighting that was occurring further west was that there were few German mobile forces attached to the 9th Army, and those that they had were not being used in the initial assaults. This meant that the Germans could not sort of outpace the retreating French, which often meant that instead of quick movements to surround and cut off the retreat of French forces, they just sort of bludgeoned the French back across the entire front. The attacks of the 9th Army, along with those of von Rundstedt's Army Group A further to the east, would be more reminiscent of the German attacks in 1918 than the armored attacks that were occurring further west. Part of this was due to the composition of the German forces, which were almost entirely made out of infantry. But this was also possible because of the French defensive system of village strongpoints, because that lent them they were very weak against an infiltration-style attack, something that had become famous at the hands of the German stormtroopers during the First World War. That attacking system was built around the idea that strongpoints should be bypassed, surrounded, and then reduced, either through artillery or infantry attack, which the French tactics were particularly weak against because they had gaps in between their strongpoints. In the early hours of June 9th, the forces under von Rundstedt would also finally join in the attack by throwing 3 infantry armies, the 2nd, 12th, and 16th, at the French along a front 80 kilometers wide to the east of the German 9th Army. This would give the Germans a considerable numerical advantage along the front, with the French commanders along a portion of this front choosing to reorganize their forces at exactly the worst time, the night before the German attack. Now, the goal of this reshuffle was not necessarily bad. The French commander wanted to move one division into reserve to provide him a little bit more flexibility to meet any German actions. But it would not be complete when the German attacks began on the morning of the 9th, and the disorganization of the defenders was the worst of all possible outcomes when faced with the German offensive. Some French troops would still be on the move when the German artillery started dropping on top of them at 3:30 in the morning on the 9th. Along with the standard artillery shells, a good number of smoke shells were mixed in, another tactic borrowed from the First World War. This was used in many areas to cover assault crossings of the river, the Aisne River in this case, which were almost entirely successful. In some areas, the river was actually completely undefended, like along the areas defended by the 45th Infantry Division, which had already pulled one of its regiments back from the river because it was supposed to be replaced by a regiment from the 42nd Infantry Division, but that regiment had not yet arrived, giving the German infantry the gift of a totally unopposed crossing. Along much of the front, after the troops crossed the river, pontoon bridges were being thrown across the river as quickly as possible, with the goal of bringing more infantry across, as well as opening up the opportunity for the two panzer divisions commanded by General Guderian to get into the fighting. The goal of the German attacks was to break through the French defenses before committing the tanks and before they were kind of brought into play, under the belief that this would allow them to use their mobility without first wasting their strength against the French defenses, as had happened at Amiens, for example. The forwardmost units of the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions would begin crossing the river on the night of June 9th, less than 24 hours after the start of the offensive, and they were doing so in preparation for joining the attacks the next day. But before they could do that, the French were planning a counterattack. This would be launched by a group of forces that represented the entire mobile reserve of the French Fourth Army. While the forces put together included French tank units, there was a serious lack of cohesion among the units involved, as they were mostly just thrown together, and the tanks that were available were at serious risk of breakdown due to the fact that they had been running for so long, they were well behind their maintenance schedule, I guess you'd say. But before that attack could be launched, the news of the actions on the Aisne produced an even greater worry at French High Command on June 9th, with Weygand saying to the French War Cabinet that the fighting along the Aisne was one in which, quote, "our armies are fighting the last possible defensive battle. If this attempt fails, they are doomed to rapid destruction," end quote. Now, the fighting was certainly desperate, but that quote is really tinged with Weygand's defeatism, which he was really deep into at this point. Back on the front along the Aisne, in the early hours of June 10th, as the French were still preparing for their counterattack, the Germans were further along in their preparations, and at about 5:30 a.m., the German attack started under a thick fog. This would be one instance where Guderian was simply too impatient, because instead of waiting another day for the German infantry to continue to push back the French infantry and to reduce some more strong points, he wanted to get his panzer units into the action. While the previous day of fighting had seen some of the French positions destroyed or neutralized by the German infantry, those that still existed did exactly the same thing to Guderian's tanks as they had done on other areas of the front. They tore them apart. This meant that even though the French units were often isolated and immobile, they were able to slow down the German armored units and cause them to spend even more of their strength on mopping up operations. If the German panzer divisions had held off for maybe another day, they would have been able to move over to the attack at a point where they could have better used their mobility, instead of being stuck on the French hedgehogs. While the Germans were using their armored units a bit too early in their efforts, on the French side, they were frantically trying to get into a position to launch their own counterattack with their own armored units. The clock was ticking because it would be the counterattack that would relieve the various surrounded French units that had been bypassed by earlier German attacks, with their best hope of being relieved being the attack of the French armor, which was being positioned for the counterattack. Even though the Germans in some areas were prepared to meet the attack, in other areas, their fire would be ineffective because they were facing, once again, the Char B-1 BIS tanks. Just as in every other instance where the B-1s were used, they would prove to be almost impervious to the smaller German anti-tank guns, with one tank during the French attack on June 10th being hit by more than 100 3.7 centimeter shells without suffering any damage. Unfortunately for the French tanks, no matter how well they did against these smaller German anti-tank guns, it was always only a matter of time before larger German artillery was brought in and the Chars started to be disabled by direct hits from 88mm and 105mm shells. Overall, the French counterattack would accomplish some of its goals, although they were generally limited to rescuing specific trapped French units in the areas defended by the French 2nd Infantry Division. They were unfortunately unable to make a larger impact on the German offensive, and much like in other areas, once the front sort of came unhinged from the river, in this case the Aisne River that it was anchored on, the French commanders in the area began to look behind them for the next obstacle that they could retreat behind. In this case, it was the 4th Army Group commanded by General Hunziker, who would order his troops to retreat back behind the Marne River, which meant handing Rheims over to the Germans. The first to receive these orders would be the French 4th Army, but they would also be joined in the retreat by the 2nd Army. The beginning of the collapse along the entire defensive front, especially along the Aisne, and the loss of territory that would occur in the days after the start of the German attack, began to turn the disagreements that had been happening among the French leaders back in Paris into major arguments. Weygand had, from the moment that the front had solidified on the Somme and Aisne River, come to believe that it was imperative that the line be held on those two rivers, and that it would be the final defensive line that the French army would be able to create. As it began to crumble, Weygand's pessimism and defeatism were taken to another level, and it was amplified by the growing prominence of Marshal Pétain, who had been brought into the government to try and bolster French resistance, but was in some ways doing the exact opposite. Reynaud, the prime minister, knowing that he was now surrounded by a more pessimistic set of leaders, also brought Charles de Gaulle in as Under-Secretary of War. Now, de Gaulle was a positive voice. He was a real go-getter. But he was also a relatively junior officer, and there was only so much that he could do against the more senior voices like Weygand, who was the commander-in-chief of the army, and the veritable institution that Pétain was among the leadership of the French military. While there were many conversations about the situation at the front during these meetings, there were also discussions about what the French plans were for further resistance, and what that resistance might look like, with ideas such as the formulation of a national redoubt in Brittany, or even the retreat of the French government and military to North Africa. But of more immediate concern was what to do about Paris. Because as soon as the Germans reached the Seine at Rouen, it was only a matter of time before they were also able to approach the French capital. At least initially, Weygand wanted to defend the city from the Germans, with the military governor of Paris, Pierre Herring, being put in command of the defense of the city. However, he did not have very much to work with about 30,000 or so reservists in the city, and then about 40,000 troops from a variety of units that had retreated back towards the city over the previous days. The only good news is that there were 2 colonial infantry divisions that had just arrived from North Africa, and they could be expected to provide stout resistance, as the French colonial forces always had up to this point in the war, and honestly always would. Along with simply defending the city, these troops would also be responsible for defending the crossings over the Seine for up to 50 kilometers to the west of the city, which stretched out their numbers more than they probably should have. The good news is that if the city was defended, it could provide valuable time for the rest of the French forces to recover from the previous days of the attack, as a city the size of Paris would not be quickly taken, either through siege or through assault. And in fact, as much as possible up to this point in the war, big cities like Paris had been avoided, and when they had been attacked by the Germans, like what had happened at Warsaw back in September 1939, it really had not went well for the German forces. There was, of course, a downside of defending Paris, though, because it would probably be destroyed, or partially destroyed, or somewhat destroyed. There would be destruction. As the Germans approached the city, the desire to sacrifice Paris in this way, in the name of continued resistance, began to wane. And instead, the pessimists at French high command began to advocate for declaring Paris an open city to avoid its destruction. For many, the defense of France was entering its endgame, and there was only one remaining option, an armistice. And if that was the case, then Paris should be left alone.